There is a place on the map that looks like it's trying to stab the Indian Ocean, a jagged horn of land jutting out from the northeastern tip of Africa, pointing straight at Arabia across a narrow stretch of sea. Sailors have known it for 3,000 years. Ancient Egyptians called it the land of Punt, the place where incense came from, where the gods lived closer to the earth. The Greeks called it Cape Aromatica, the fragrant cape, because the wind coming off its shores smelled of myrrh before you could even see the coastline. Today, most people know this place for one thing: chaos. Failed state, pirates, famine, a country that collapsed so completely it became the world's dictionary definition of a nation coming apart at the seams. But here's what the headlines never told you. Before Somalia became a symbol of everything that can go wrong with a country, it was home to one of the most ancient, most distinctive, and most stubbornly independent civilizations on the African continent, a people who built trading empires while Europe was still fumbling through the Dark Ages, a people who memorized entire libraries in their heads because they had no written language and didn't need one, a people so fiercely egalitarian that they never built kings, never built pyramids, never bowed to any man as an absolute ruler. And here is the curiosity that will sit with you through this entire story. That same fierce independence, that same refusal to submit, is the quality that produced both their greatest glories and their most catastrophic self-destruction. By the time we reach the end of this history, you'll understand exactly what I mean. The very thing that made Somalia impossible to conquer from outside, made it impossible to hold together from within. Let's start at the beginning, with the land itself, because in Somalia, everything begins with the land. Chapter 1. The Horn of the World. Somalia before the world knew its name. Imagine a territory roughly the size of Texas, which is already a fairly enormous thing to imagine, and then drain almost all the water out of it. That's the Somali landscape, a vast, sun-hammered plateau stretching from the Gulf of Aden in the north down to the Indian Ocean coast in the southeast, rimmed by the Ethiopian highlands to the west, bleeding into the scrublands of Kenya to the south. The northern coastline is a brutal volcanic place, the Guban Plain, which takes its name from the Somali word for burned. In the hottest months, temperatures there sit above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The rains, when they come at all, arrive twice a year in fitful, unreliable bursts, March to June, September to December, and in some years, they barely come at all. Further inland, the land rises into ranges like the Golis and Ogo mountains, where the air is cooler and the vegetation a little less desperate. The southern interior opens into the Haud, a broad, rolling plateau of thornbush and grass that straddles what is today the Somalia-Ethiopia border. The Haud has no permanent water sources. None. In the dry seasons, it empties out. In the wet seasons, it blooms, and the pastoralists follow the blooming. Only in the far south does the landscape relent. Two great rivers, the Shabelle and the Juba, flow down from the Ethiopian highlands toward the Indian Ocean, creating narrow ribbons of green in an otherwise parched world. The Shabelle, the longer of the two, actually never reaches the sea in most years. It turns south and eventually loses itself in swamps and sandbanks, as if the land simply absorbs it before it can escape. The Juba makes it through, and between these two rivers lies the only truly fertile agricultural zone in the entire Somali territory, a strip of land that will be fought over, colonized, farmed by force, and drowned in blood for centuries to come. This geography is not background detail, it is the central character of Somali history, because a land this dry, this unpredictable, this stingy with its water, does not reward people who settle down and build cities. It rewards people who move. The Somali people are, at their historical core, nomads. Not nomads in the romantic, wandering freely sense that the word sometimes suggests, but nomads in the deeply practical, brutally disciplined sense of people who have engineered an entire civilization around the problem of moving livestock through a landscape that is trying to kill them. The central animal of this civilization is the camel. Not the horse, not the cow, though both have their place. The camel. And to understand why, to really understand it, you have to think about what a camel actually is. A biological machine specifically designed for a world without reliable water. A camel can go without drinking for days at a time, then consume enormous quantities in a single session. It can eat thorny, desiccated vegetation that would destroy other animals' digestive systems. It converts fat stored in its hump into energy and hydration over long distances. In a landscape where water sources are scattered, unpredictable, and sometimes separated by days of hard travel, a camel is not just useful, it is survival itself. For Somali nomads, the camel herd was simultaneously their savings account, their grocery store, their moving truck, and their measure of social status. Camels provided milk, the primary food source for pastoralists on the move. They carried the collapsible frame houses, portable tent-like structures called akal, from one campsite to the next. They were the currency of justice. A man's life was valued at 100 camels in the traditional compensation system, a woman's life at 50. When a family wanted to negotiate a marriage, camels changed hands. When a clan wanted to settle a killing without triggering a blood feud, camels were the medium of the transaction. This is why, even as money became widespread, even as the modern world crept in at the edges, the camel remained the true measure of wealth in Somali culture. A man might own a car and a mobile phone and a concrete house in Mogadishu and still be judged by the size of his camel herd back in the interior. The animal was not just an economic resource, it was the physical embodiment of an entire value system, a symbol of endurance, of patience, of the refusal to need more than the land can give. Alongside the camel herds, most nomadic families also kept sheep and goats, smaller, more water-dependent animals that grazed closer to the women's camps, providing a secondary milk source and a more accessible reserve of portable wealth. The practical division was stark. Men travelled long distances with the camel herds, sometimes for weeks at a stretch, pushing deep into the dry interior where only camels could survive. Women, children, and the elderly stayed closer to the wells with the sheep and goats, maintaining the household camp, keeping the family's daily life running. This was not a simple or easy existence. It was a sophisticated, demanding, and meticulously organized system that required precise knowledge of pasture conditions, water locations, seasonal weather patterns, and the movements of dozens of other groups across a shared landscape. Somali pastoralists carried this knowledge not in books, they had no books, but in memory, encoded in oral tradition, in poetry, in the accumulated wisdom passed from parents to children across hundreds of generations. Here is the thing about Somali society that confounds outsiders perhaps more than anything else. For most of its history, it had no kings. No pharaohs, no emperors, no paramount chiefs who sat in palace cities and issued commands that flowed down through layers of bureaucracy to the common people. The Somali political system was, by the standards of most of the ancient world, startlingly flat. What it had instead was the clan. Every Somali traced their ancestry along a patrilineal line, father to father to father, stretching back through remembered generations to a founding ancestor. The Somali people as a whole divided into two broad groupings: the Somali, the numerically dominant branch, which included the great nomadic clans of the Darod, Hawiye, Izark, and Dir, and the Sab, a smaller grouping that included the Digil and Rahanwain, who were more settled and more agricultural, living in the fertile south. Within each of these groupings were clan families. Within clan families were clans. Within clans were subclans. Within subclans were lineage groups, a branching tree of identity that a Somali could recite from memory going back 20 or 30 generations. This genealogy was not mere family sentiment. It was a legal document. It determined whom you could marry, whom you were obligated to defend, whom you were required to compensate if one of your kinsmen wronged one of theirs, and whom you could call upon for help in a crisis. The system had its own democratic logic, rough and fierce as it was. Clan leaders, carrying titles like Sultan or Bokor, held authority by persuasion and reputation, not by force. Decisions of real consequence were made by the gathering of adult men, argued out in sessions that could go on for days, with poets and elders deploying rhetoric and precedent and social pressure until some workable consensus emerged. There was no police force. There was no state to enforce a verdict. What enforced agreements was the threat of collective consequences. If you wronged a man from another clan, his entire lineage had a legitimate grievance against your entire lineage, and only compensation or counterforce would settle it. This system, called Igzir, the traditional Somali customary law, was flexible, locally adapted, and surprisingly effective at managing the low-level friction of nomadic life. Disputes over wells, over grazing boundaries, over stolen animals. It was less effective at managing large-scale sustained threats. When the threat was big enough, when a colonial empire arrived with gunboats and rifles, the clans could not easily unite. Their entire political culture militated against submitting to a single authority, even the authority of collective survival. That tension between the democratic genius of the clan system and its catastrophic inability to produce unified political action will echo through every chapter of this story. Before we leave this foundational chapter, there is one more thing you need to understand about the Somali people, and it is perhaps the most remarkable thing about them. Until 1972, the Somali language had no written form. No alphabet, no script, no way to record words on paper or stone or animal hide. In a world where literacy is often treated as the minimum requirement for civilization, the Somali people built one of the richest oral literary traditions on earth, entirely in their heads. Somali poetry is not a folk art. It is an art form of extraordinary sophistication, with strict formal requirements around meter, alliteration, and what the tradition calls time's gifto, a kind of internal musical structure that makes the poem feel inevitable, as though the words could not have been arranged any other way. There are multiple named genres, each with its own rules, its own occasions, its own masters. A truly accomplished Somali poet was, and in many communities still is, a figure of enormous social power, capable of mobilizing public opinion, shaming enemies, cementing alliances, or commemorating the dead in ways that would echo for generations. When the colonial powers arrived and began their surveys and their map drawing, they found Somali communities who could recite genealogies going back 30 generations without a single hesitation. They found poets who could perform from memory compositions of hundreds of lines, works of art that had been transmitted mouth to ear to mouth across decades without corruption. They found a people who had solved the problem of knowledge preservation not with libraries, but with a culture that treated the human mind as the most reliable archive. This was not a poverty of civilization. It was a different kind of civilization, one built for mobility, for oral exchange, for the face-to-face transmission of knowledge across a landscape that would have made books and stone inscriptions both impractical and unnecessary. When radio arrived in Somalia in the 20th century, it didn't weaken this tradition. If anything, it amplified it. A poem broadcast from Mogadishu could reach every corner of the country in a single evening, igniting passions or shifting political winds the way a printed pamphlet might in another culture. The technology was new. The function was ancient. So here, in the opening of this long story, is Somalia before the world came to rearrange it. A landscape so harsh, it demands genius to survive in. A people who developed that genius over centuries of patient adaptation, in their animal husbandry, in their customary law, in their extraordinary oral tradition. A society that chose equality over hierarchy, consensus over command, flexibility over rigidity. A culture that prized independence above almost everything else. All of this is beautiful. All of this is worth knowing. And all of this, in the centuries to come, will be turned against the Somali people by forces from outside, and eventually by forces from within. The Horn of the World is ancient. Its story is only beginning. Chapter 2. God, Gold, and Caravans. The Age of Somali Islamic Sultanates. Here is a fact that almost every Western account of Somalia manages to skip entirely. For several centuries, while Europe was consumed by plague, religious wars, and the slow, painful crawl toward the Renaissance, the coastline of the Horn of Africa was one of the busiest, wealthiest, and most cosmopolitan commercial zones on Earth. Ships from Arabia, Persia, India, and China moved through these waters in seasonal patterns as reliable as clockwork, driven by the monsoon winds that the Indian Ocean generates twice a year, with the regularity of a breathing lung. And at the ports where those ships stopped, Zaila, Berbera, Mogadishu, Merka, Barawa, Somali merchants, Arab traders, Persian settlers, and Indian financiers conducted business in a dozen languages across a network of commerce that stretched from the Chinese coast to the Mediterranean. The world knew the Horn of Africa long before the Horn of Africa became a problem for the world to solve. What happened to that prosperity? How did a coastline that once traded frankincense to Egyptian pharaohs and ivory to Roman emperors end up as the byword for poverty and collapse? That question is not rhetorical. Halite. The answer runs through every chapter of this story, through colonialism, through Cold War manipulation, through the internal fractures of the clan system. But it begins here, in this golden age, because you cannot understand what was lost unless you first understand what existed. Long before Islam, the Somali coast was already famous. The ancient Egyptians sent expeditions to a place they called Punt. The exact location is still debated by historians, but the most credible evidence points to the Somali and Eritrean coastline. The goods they brought back were specific: myrrh, frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, and living trees of aromatic wood, carried on ships and transplanted into Egyptian temple gardens. The pharaoh Hatshepsut famously depicted one of these expeditions in elaborate relief carvings at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari, images that survive today and show, with remarkable detail, the curved prows of Egyptian ships and the strange stilted houses of the Punt people, built on platforms above the water. Whether these were Somali people in the modern ethnic sense is impossible to say with certainty, but the geographic logic is compelling, and the frankincense and myrrh trade that the ancient Egyptians documented continued without interruption for the next 3,000 years. The aromatic trees that produce these resins grow in precisely the kind of arid, rocky terrain that characterizes the northern Somali interior. The incense trade was not a historical curiosity. It was one of the foundational commercial arteries of the ancient world, feeding the altar fires of Egypt, Greece, Rome, and eventually the Christian and Islamic ceremonies that inherited those traditions. When the Greeks arrived in these waters, they called the coastline the Aromatic Cape. When the Romans came, they noted the ports of Mullah, Mundus, and Moselon, identifiable with modern Berbera and nearby sites, as regular stops on the Indian Ocean trading route. The Roman merchant manual known as the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, written around the 1st century AD, gives precise descriptions of these ports. What they traded, who governed them, what the anchorage was like, how the local people behaved toward foreign ships. It reads, in places, almost like a modern traveller's guide. The Somali coast was, by any measure, integrated into the global economy nearly 2,000 years ago. Then came Islam, and it changed everything. The Prophet Muhammad died in 632 AD. Within a decade, Arab armies had swept across the Middle East, into Persia, and across North Africa. Within a century, the Islamic world stretched from Spain to Central Asia, and throughout this period of explosive expansion, the Arab relationship with the sea, with trade, with the monsoon networks of the Indian Ocean, only deepened. The Somali coast received Islam early. How early is a matter of scholarly debate, but the oral traditions are consistent. Within a generation or two of the Prophet's death, Arab and Persian Muslim traders and missionaries were establishing footholds along the northern Somali coastline. They came primarily as merchants. They stayed as settlers. They married local women. Their children grew up speaking Somali and Arabic interchangeably, practicing a form of Islam filtered through Somali cultural norms, and eventually they became something new, neither purely Arab nor purely Somali, but a coastal civilization that was genuinely its own thing. The key port in this early period was Zeila, a town perched on the Gulf of Aden at the point where the Somali coast curves toward the Afar lowlands and modern Djibouti. Zeila's geography made it almost inevitable as a commercial hub. It sat at the mouth of the trade routes that ran inland through the Ethiopian highlands, channeling the products of the Abyssinian interior, ivory, gold, enslaved people, animal hides, down to the coast and onto waiting ships bound for Arabia and beyond. In return, textiles, metalwork, weapons and manufactured goods flowed back up the same routes into the highland kingdoms. The Arab geographer al-Yaqubi mentioned Zeila in the late 9th century, one of the earliest written references to the town, and subsequent Arab writers gave it increasingly detailed descriptions. By the medieval period, it was the capital of a Muslim sultanate called Adal, itself the successor to the earlier Ifat Sultanate, a polity that stretched across the lowland plains between the Ethiopian plateau and the Somali coast. Zeila's population was a genuine mixture. Arab settlers who had been there for generations, indigenous Somali clans who dominated the surrounding countryside, and Afar and Harari people who brought trade goods down from the interior. The mosques were old. The merchant families were established. The commerce was serious. While the coast was building its port cities, something equally consequential was happening in the interior. Over the course of roughly 1,000 years, from around the 9th century through the 19th, the Somali people undertook one of the largest and most sustained population expansions in African history, moving primarily from north to south, following pasture and water, pushed by population growth and pulled by the availability of less densely occupied land. Somali clans gradually spread across an enormous territory, from the Gulf of Aden coast in the north, down through the central plateau, into the fertile inter-riverine zone between the Shebelle and Juba rivers, and eventually south into what is today northern Kenya. This was not a single event. It was not a conquest in the military sense, though military conflict certainly played a role. It was a slow generational process, clans moving, settling temporarily, moving again, absorbing or displacing the peoples they encountered, gradually extending the geographic reach of Somali language, culture, and clan identity across an area that had previously been home to a much more diverse mixture of populations. The people displaced or absorbed included Oromo pastoralists, Bantu agricultural communities living along the river valleys, and various hunter-gatherer groups in the south. The Bantu communities in particular, whom Arab geographers referred to by the collective term Zanj, had been living along the Shebelle and Juba rivers for centuries before the Somali expansion reached them. Their descendants are still there today. Small communities of Somali Bantu people, speaking a distinctive dialect, practicing agriculture in the river valleys, occupying a marginal social position in Somali society that has persisted through every subsequent political upheaval. The oral traditions of the major Somali clans remember this expansion vividly. The Darod, who became the most numerous and widely distributed of all Somali clan families, trace their origins to an Arab ancestor who arrived by sea and married into a local Dir clan, a genealogical story that neatly combines the twin sources of Somali cultural identity, indigenous African roots and Arab Islamic heritage. The Hawiye remember their expansion into the central regions around modern Mogadishu. The Isaac trace their founding ancestor to a Muslim holy man who arrived from Arabia and whose descendants gradually became the dominant force in what is today northern Somalia. These genealogies are not straightforward historical records. They are partly mythological, partly political, tools for legitimizing territorial claims and social hierarchies in the present by anchoring them in a venerated past. But they encode real historical movements, real processes of migration and cultural fusion that other types of evidence, archaeological, linguistic, and comparative, broadly confirm. If Xyla was the queen of the northern Somali coast, Mogadishu was the queen of the south, and for several centuries it was one of the most important cities in the entire Indian Ocean world. The Arab traveller Ibn Battuta visited Mogadishu in 1331, and his account is one of the most vivid descriptions of medieval African urban life that survives. He was struck, first, by the sheer scale of the place. The Sultan of Mogadishu, he wrote, commanded a substantial court and received foreign visitors with considerable ceremony. The city had its own judicial system, its own scholars, its own administrative apparatus. The food was extraordinary. Ibn Battuta described enormous communal meals of rice cooked in butter, with side dishes of meat, chicken, fish, and vegetables, all served on a scale that suggested real surplus and organizational capacity. The merchants of Mogadishu at this period were conducting trade across the entire western Indian Ocean. Mogadishu cloth, a particular type of textile manufactured in and around the city, was exported as far as Egypt, and its name appears in Egyptian commercial records. Chinese porcelain fragments recovered by archaeologists from medieval sites at Mogadishu and other Somali coastal towns testify to the reach of the networks these merchants inhabited. The Chinese themselves sent trading expeditions to East Africa during the early 15th century, and the Somali coast was on their itinerary. Further down the coast, the towns of Merka and Barawa were similarly integrated into the Indian Ocean commercial world. Barawa in particular maintained a distinct cultural identity. Its inhabitants spoke a Bantu language called Bravanese that was separate from Somali, reflecting the town's origins as a Bantu settlement that had been gradually Islamicized and incorporated into the Somali cultural sphere without being fully linguistically absorbed. This kind of layered complexity, Somali, Arab, Bantu, Persian cultural elements sitting on top of each other in a single town was characteristic of the entire coast. This was not a simple place. It was not a primitive place. It was a cosmopolitan, sophisticated, multilingual, commercially dynamic civilization that had been growing and developing for over 1,000 years before the first European ship appeared on the horizon. The most dramatic episode of this entire era, and the one with the most far-reaching consequences, was the 16th century jihad against the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia. The conflict had deep roots. The Abyssinian Highland Kingdom, Christian since the 4th century, and the Muslim sultanates of the lowland Somali coast had been in a state of intermittent tension for centuries. The highlands and the lowlands needed each other commercially. The trade routes that ran through Xyla depended on access to the Abyssinian interior, but they were also natural rivals for political dominance over the territories between them. Periodically, the Abyssinian emperors pushed down into the lowlands, extracting tribute and demonstrating military superiority. Periodically, the lowland Muslim polities pushed back. In the 1520s, the balance shifted catastrophically for Abyssinia. A young military commander named Ahmad ibn Ibrahim al-Ghazi rose to power within the Adal Sultanate. He was known by his enemies as Ahmad Gran, Ahmad the Left-Handed, and he would become one of the most formidable military figures in the history of East Africa. He was Somali, almost certainly from the Hati clan group, and he combined genuine military genius with a powerful religious vision. The unification of all the Muslim peoples of the Horn of Africa under a single banner for a war of conquest against the Christian Empire to the north. The jihad he launched in the early 1530s was, by any measure, stunning in its initial success. Ahmad Gran's forces, a coalition of Somali, Afar, and Arab fighters, equipped in part with Ottoman firearms obtained from the Yemeni coast, swept through the Abyssinian highlands in a series of campaigns that reduced the ancient Christian kingdom to a fraction of its former territory. Churches and monasteries that had stood for 1,000 years were destroyed. The Abyssinian emperor was driven into the mountains. For over a decade, it appeared genuinely possible that the Christian kingdom of Abyssinia might cease to exist altogether. What saved Abyssinia was not its own strength. It was a Portuguese intervention. The Portuguese, who had established themselves along the East African coast and in the Red Sea during the early 16th century, sent a military expedition to aid their fellow Christians. Portuguese musketeers, combined with Abyssinian resistance, turned the tide. Ahmad Gran was killed in battle in 1543, shot, according to tradition, by a Portuguese soldier. Without his leadership, the coalition collapsed. The Somali and Afar forces withdrew. Abyssinia survived. But the scars of this conflict ran deep and lasted centuries. The boundaries between the highland Christian kingdom and the lowland Muslim peoples were redrawn in blood. The mutual suspicion between what would become Ethiopia and what would become Somalia never fully healed. When the European powers arrived 3 centuries later to draw their colonial borders, they drew them across a landscape already shaped by this ancient rivalry, and the borders they drew made it infinitely worse. By the 18th century, the golden age of the Somali coastal cities was fading. The Portuguese had disrupted the Indian Ocean trade networks in the 16th century by forcing ships through their controlled routes and extracting tolls at gunpoint. The great empires that had sustained the demand for Somali exports, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Fatimid Sultanate of Egypt, had long since collapsed or transformed beyond recognition. The Ottoman Empire absorbed the Red Sea zone, but never extended its effective control to the Somali coast. And the interior, always more powerful in Somali political life than outsiders realized, was reasserting itself. The nomadic clans of the interior increasingly dominated the political landscape, while the coastal cities contracted in importance. The cities did not vanish. Mogadishu, Merka, Barawa, Xyla, Berbera, all of them persisted. Trade continued. Life went on. But the extraordinary flourishing of the medieval period, the moment when Mogadishu was a city that an Arab traveller considered worth describing at length, when Somali cloth was traded in Egypt, when the entire coast was plugged into a global commercial network, that moment had passed. And into the space left by its passing, something new was coming, from across the sea, with maps and flags, and the absolute certainty that they had the right to draw lines. Chapter 3. The Carve-up. When empires drew lines through a people. Picture a map, not the map of Somalia you might find today, that single recognizable shape on the Horn of Africa. Picture instead a map from the early 19th century, before the European powers arrived with their surveying equipment and their treaty papers, and their absolute confidence in their own authority. On that earlier map, there are no clean national borders cutting across the Somali territory. There are no straight lines drawn by rulers on a drafting table in London, or Paris, or Rome. There is simply a vast expanse of land, inhabited by a people who recognized each other by language, by custom, by genealogy, by the shared grammar of the clan system. A people who, despite their internal divisions, understood themselves as a single human community. Now watch what happens to that map over the course of about 40 years. By 1897, that community had been sliced into 5 separate pieces, each governed by a different foreign power, each piece cut off from the others by borders that bore no relationship to the actual distribution of Somali people, Somali pastures, Somali water sources, or Somali clan territories. British Somaliland in the north, Italian Somalia in the south and east, French Somaliland in the tiny but strategically critical territory around the port of Djibouti, and then 2 additional pieces that were not even called Somalia at all, the Ogaden Plateau, handed to Abyssinia, and the Northern Frontier District, handed to Kenya, both of them home to large Somali populations who suddenly found themselves classified as subjects of non-Somali states. 5 pieces, 5 flags, 1 people. This was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate construction built by competing imperial interests in the space of a single generation, and it planted a charge inside Somali political life that would detonate, repeatedly, catastrophically, for the next century and beyond. Every war Somalia fought after independence, every irredentist dream, every moment when the country tore itself apart, reaching for a unity that the borders made impossible, all of it traces back to 40 years of map drawing that the Somali people had absolutely no part in. But to understand how it happened, you have to understand why 4 separate empires suddenly became interested in a territory they had largely ignored for centuries. And that story begins not in Somalia at all, but in Egypt, with a waterway that changed the geometry of the entire world. On the 17th of November 1869, the Suez Canal opened. Before that date, the sea route from Europe to Asia ran around the southern tip of Africa, a voyage of months through treacherous waters around the Cape of Good Hope. After that date, the same journey could be made in a fraction of the time by sailing through the canal into the Red Sea and out into the Indian Ocean. The Red Sea, previously a commercial backwater, became overnight one of the most strategically vital bodies of water on Earth. And what sat at the southern end of the Red Sea, controlling the passage between the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean? The Gulf of Aden. And what sat along the Gulf of Aden? The northern Somali coast. Britain had already recognised this. They had seized the port of Aden directly across the Gulf of Aden from the Somali coast back in 1839, 3 decades before the canal opened. They took it primarily as a coaling station on the route to India, and the garrison there was almost entirely dependent on food imports from the Somali coast, particularly meat from the nomadic communities around Berbera. The Somali coast was, in British military calculations, essentially a supply depot for Aden. This was a narrow and unglamorous way to think about an entire people's homeland, but it was entirely characteristic of how Britain approached Somalia for most of the colonial period. The official in London viewed the Somali coast not as a place worth developing or governing for its own sake, but as a buffer zone, a territory that needed to be kept orderly enough not to interfere with the real prize, which was Aden, which was India, which was the whole apparatus of British imperial trade. What forced Britain's hand was competition. The competition arrived from multiple directions almost simultaneously, which was itself a product of a broader European dynamic, the so-called scramble for Africa, the period between roughly 1880 and 1900, when European powers, driven by a volatile mixture of economic interest, nationalist rivalry, and ideological conviction in their own civilizing mission, divided almost the entire African continent among themselves with a speed and thoroughness that astonished even the people doing the dividing. France moved first on the Somali coast. In 1859, the French consul in Aden quietly negotiated a lease on the small port of Obok from the Afar chiefs who controlled the territory around what is today Djibouti. The French did almost nothing with this acquisition for 2 decades. The lease sat largely dormant while Paris focused its imperial energies elsewhere. But after the Suez Canal opened, the strategic logic of having a foothold at the mouth of the Red Sea became impossible to ignore. By the 1880s, France was actively developing Djibouti as a commercial and military port, and the territory it eventually claimed, the small but geographically critical slice of land between Somali and Afar populations, would remain in French hands until 1977. Italy came next, and Italy's interest in the Somali coast was both more ambitious and more confused than France's. Italy in the 1880s was a newly unified nation, economically struggling, politically volatile, and desperately anxious to be taken seriously as a great power. Colonies were the marker of great power status in this era, and Italy wanted them badly. A former missionary named Giuseppe Sapeto, acting on behalf of the Italian Foreign Ministry, began negotiating with local rulers along the Red Sea coast in the 1860s, eventually securing a foothold at Assab in what is today Eritrea. From this beginning, Italian interest expanded southward along the Somali coast. Through a mixture of treaties with local sultans, some of whom understood what they were signing, many of whom did not, Italy gradually accumulated claims over the southern and eastern Somali coast. The agreements were frequently ambiguous, poorly translated, and contested from the moment the ink dried. But they gave Italy the legal fig leaf it needed to plant its flag, and by the late 1880s, Italian Somalia was taking shape as a colonial entity, centered on Mogadishu and extending down the coast and inland in ways that expanded steadily until the 1920s. Egypt also entered the picture, which might seem surprising until you remember that Egypt in this period was itself under the expanding influence of the Ottoman Empire, and both Ottoman Turkey and its Egyptian vassal had historical claims, however attenuated, to sovereignty over parts of the Red Sea coast. The Egyptian Khedive sent expeditions to Zaila and Berbera in the early 1870s, raised Egyptian flags, and demanded the loyalty of local clan leaders. This alarmed Britain considerably, not because anyone in London actually cared about Egyptian sovereignty over Somalia, but because an Egyptian presence on the Somali coast created instability that might threaten Aden's meat supply and complicate British calculations about the Red Sea more broadly. Through a mixture of diplomacy and strategic pressure, Britain manoeuvred Egypt out of the picture over the following decade, a process accelerated by Egypt's own financial and political collapse in the early 1880s, which brought Egypt itself under British financial control and eventually British military occupation. Once Egypt was neutralised as an independent actor, the Somali coast became a three-way competition between Britain, France, and Italy, with Abyssinia lurking as a fourth claimant from the interior. The role of Abyssinia, what we today call Ethiopia, in the partition of Somalia, is a chapter that Somali historical memory keeps vivid and painful. The Abyssinian emperor, Menelik II, was, by any measure, one of the most capable rulers of his era. He modernized his army. He played the European powers against each other with considerable skill. And in 1896 he handed Italy a crushing military defeat at the Battle of Adwa, the first decisive victory of an African army over a European colonial force, an event that reverberated around the world and secured Abyssinian independence at precisely the moment when the rest of Africa was being absorbed into European empires. But Menelik was not merely defending Abyssinia, he was expanding it. And the direction of his expansion was, in significant part, into Somali-inhabited territory. The Ogaden Plateau, the vast, semi-arid expanse that lies between the Ethiopian highlands and the Somali coast, had been a zone of Somali pastoral activity for centuries. The Darod clan families, particularly the Ogaden clan for whom the plateau is named, had been moving their herds across this territory in seasonal patterns long before Menelik's armies arrived. But the plateau was also a contested frontier zone, claimed intermittently by Abyssinian rulers, and Menelik moved to formalize his control over it as part of his broader program of imperial expansion. In 1897, Britain, anxious to secure Abyssinian cooperation on other matters and unwilling to spend political capital defending nomadic Somali pastoral rights against an African ally, essentially gifted Menelik control over the Ogaden in a treaty that the Somali people were not party to and had no knowledge of until after it was signed. with a stroke of a pen in a negotiation conducted entirely by others. Somewhere between a quarter and a third of the territory that Somali clans considered their homeland was transferred to Abyssinian sovereignty. The Somali people who lived and herded in the Ogaden received no compensation, no consultation, and no explanation. The treaty simply declared that the land was now Abyssinian. The nomadic pastoralists who had been crossing it for generations were now, by legal definition, foreign subjects moving through foreign territory. It is worth pausing here to examine exactly how these agreements were reached, because the process itself tells you something important about the nature of what was happening. The standard British method for acquiring a Somali coastal territory was to anchor a ship offshore, invite the relevant clan leaders aboard, and present them with a document written in English. Nome. The document would be explained to the clan leaders through an interpreter, with varying degrees of accuracy. The clan leaders, men whose political authority was rooted in the oral, consensual traditions of Somali customary law, who had no framework for understanding what a written treaty with a foreign government actually meant in practice, would place their marks on the paper. They understood, typically, that they were agreeing to some form of relationship with the British government. They did not understand, because it was not explained to them clearly, and in some cases was deliberately obscured, that they were signing away sovereignty over their territory, that the agreement would be permanent, that it would bind their descendants indefinitely, and that it would be used to justify the installation of a foreign administration with the power to override their own authority. The Italian approach was similar, and in some cases more brazen. The sultans of the Benadir coast, who had been conducting perfectly ordinary commercial relations with Italian traders and companies for years, found themselves reclassified as Italian subjects through a series of agreements that bore increasingly little resemblance to what they thought they had agreed to. When they protested, the protests were ignored. When they resisted, they were suppressed. What made all of this possible, what gave it the veneer of legal legitimacy that the colonial powers found necessary to maintain, was the doctrine, widely held in European international law of this period, that African political entities did not constitute proper states in the legal sense, that their leaders lacked the authority to make binding agreements, and therefore that their territories were effectively ownerless and available for European appropriation. The Somali sultans and clan leaders were simultaneously treated as legitimate enough to sign treaties when those treaties served European interests, and illegitimate enough to be overridden when their own understanding of what they had signed conflicted with European interpretation. This was the foundational hypocrisy of the scramble for Africa, and it was applied to Somalia with particular thoroughness. When the dust settled in the late 1890s, the map of the Somali Horn looked like this. Britain controlled the northern coast, a narrow strip of territory along the Gulf of Aden that became the British Somaliland Protectorate, governed from Berbera. Britain's interest in this territory remained what it had always been, keeping it stable enough not to cause problems for Aden. Investment in roads, schools, hospitals, or economic development was minimal. The Protectorate was administered on the cheap by a small number of British officers who were under strict instructions not to spend money or make trouble. Italy controlled the southern and eastern coast, a much larger territory extending from Mogadishu down to the Juba River and inland across the agricultural interriverine zone. Italy's approach to its Somali territory would shift over time, from commercial exploitation through chartered companies to more direct colonial administration under the fascist government that came to power in the 1920s. But the fundamental pattern was extraction and control. France controlled the small but critical territory around Djibouti, which it valued almost entirely for its port and its position at the mouth of the Red Sea. The Somali population of the French territory was a minority. The territory was shared with the Afar people, and French colonial policy focused overwhelmingly on the port city rather than the interior. The Ogaden was Abyssinian. The northern frontier district was British Kenya, and the people of all these territories, who spoke the same language, shared the same clan relationships, followed the same customary law, herded the same animals across the same seasonal pastures, now lived under 5 different governments, 5 different legal systems, 5 different relationships to the wider world. The borders did not follow rivers or mountain ranges. They cut straight through clan territories, separating the summer pastures from the winter pastures that the same nomadic communities had been moving between for generations. A Darid family that had always moved between the Ogaden Plateau and the Horde could now find itself crossing an international boundary twice a year in the course of a completely ordinary, completely traditional seasonal migration. A man from Berbera with relatives in Djibouti now needed, in theory, to cross from one colonial jurisdiction into another to visit his own kinsmen. The Somali people did not accept this. They never accepted this, and the next chapter of their history would be written in the language that the colonial powers had made inevitable, the language of armed resistance. There is a particular cruelty to the legacy of these borders that goes beyond the immediate injustice of their drawing. The borders created a political problem with no solution inside the available political framework. Somali nationalism, the desire to unite all Somali inhabited territories into a single state, was both completely understandable and structurally impossible to achieve without dismantling the border agreements of five separate international powers, including the Charter of the Organization of African Unity, which in 1963 would formally commit all African states to respect the colonial boundaries they inherited at independence. Every Somali government from independence in 1960 onward would claim the right to the Ogaden, the northern frontier district, and eventually Djibouti. Every neighbouring government would reject those claims. Every attempt to resolve the question by force would end in disaster. And through all of it, the Somali people who lived in those territories would remain subjects of foreign states: Ethiopians, Kenyans, Djiboutians by the passport the colonial cartographers had assigned them, Somalis by every other measure of identity that mattered. The lines drawn in the 1880s and 1890s were not simply political boundaries, they were a sentence, and Somalia would spend the next century trying, and failing, to appeal it. But the appeal was still decades away. First, there was resistance. And resistance, in Somalia, began with a single extraordinary man, a camel army, and a war that lasted 20 years. Chapter 4. The Mad Mullah. Somalia's first war of liberation. The British called him the Mad Mullah. It was exactly the kind of label that empires attach to people they cannot defeat and refuse to understand. A two-word dismissal designed to make a serious man sound like a lunatic, to make a political movement sound like a religious tantrum, to make 20 years of armed resistance sound like the irrational ravings of a fanatic who simply needed to be put down. The man himself had a different name: Sayyid Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. Sayyid, a title of religious distinction, indicating descent from the Prophet. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, a name that carried, in the Somali oral tradition, the weight of poetry, scholarship, and prophetic fury. He was a theologian who could debate Islamic jurisprudence with the finest scholars of his age. He was a poet whose compositions were so powerful, so precisely aimed, so devastating in their imagery, that British officers in the field reported their Somali allies deserting after hearing them recited in camp. He was a military commander who kept 3 colonial empires, Britain, Italy, and Abyssinia, at bay simultaneously for 2 full decades, with an army built almost entirely from camel riders and clan loyalty. Mad? The man was one of the most formidable figures in the entire history of African resistance to European colonialism. The British called him mad because the alternative, admitting that he was brilliant, that his cause was legitimate, that their own presence in his country was the original provocation, was not something a Victorian imperial officer was equipped to say out loud. This is his story. And it is a story that Somalia has never forgotten, and the world has almost entirely missed. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan was born around 1,856 inches, the Ogaden region, that vast plateau that Britain would hand to Abyssinia 4 decades later, to a family of the Ogaden clan of the Darod Confederation. His father was a nomadic pastoralist. His mother, according to tradition, was from the Isaac clan, a detail that would later become politically significant, given the interclan tensions that complicated his movement. From childhood, he showed an exceptional aptitude for the twin Somali arts of memory and language. He memorized the Quran early, studied Islamic law with local scholars, and began composing poetry in the intricate formal traditions of the Somali oral genre. By his 20s, he had already developed a reputation as a religious scholar and a preacher of unusual force, someone who could hold a crowd, not just with the content of what he said, but with the sheer physical and emotional intensity of how he said it. In 1894, he made the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, that is one of the 5 pillars of Islam, and it transformed him. In Mecca, he encountered the Salihiyya Brotherhood, a reformist Sufi order founded by the Sudanese scholar Muhammad Saleh. The Salihiyya emphasized a stricter, more scripturally grounded practice of Islam, pushed back against what it saw as the lax and syncretic religious customs of many African Muslim communities, and demanded a more active engagement with the political conditions affecting Muslim peoples worldwide. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan returned to Somalia as a Salihiyya initiate, with a reformer's fire and a growing certainty that what he saw around him, his people's land being parcelled out to foreign powers, their religious practices being diluted by colonial influence, their clan leaders signing away sovereignty they had no right to surrender, required not just spiritual renewal, but active, organised resistance. The trigger came almost immediately. In the late 1890s, British and Italian administrators were consolidating their control over Somali territory. Catholic missionaries, operating with the tacit support of the Italian colonial administration, were establishing mission stations in southern Somalia, converting some Somali children to Christianity, and running schools that taught Italian language and Catholic religious instruction alongside each other. In the British Protectorate, colonial officials were interfering with traditional clan governance, imposing new regulations, and most provocatively, confiscating weapons from the Somali population, the weapons that nomadic communities depended on not just for warfare, but for protecting their herds from predators and rival clans. For Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, this was not a collection of administrative inconveniences. It was an assault on everything that defined his people's identity, their religion, their autonomy, their capacity for self-defense. He began preaching resistance. His sermons drew crowds. His poetry, circulated orally across the clan networks, spread his message faster and further than any printed newspaper could have. In 1899, he wrote to the British authorities. The letter, whose text survives, is a remarkable document, equal parts theological argument, political ultimatum, and barely contained fury. He accused the British of corrupting Somali youth through their schools, of stripping his people of their weapons and dignity, and of collaborating with Christian missionaries to undermine Islam. He demanded that the colonial presence withdraw. The British response was to classify him as a troublemaker and dispatch a police force to arrest him. He was already gone. He had taken to the interior with a small band of followers, his camels, and his certainty that God was on his side. The dervish movement, the Darawish, as they called themselves in Somali, had begun. What followed was one of the longest and most remarkable armed resistance campaigns in the history of colonialism, a 20-year guerrilla war conducted across the brutal terrain of the Somali interior by a force that never had more than a few thousand fighters at its peak, against three separate colonial powers that between them commanded the resources of large portions of the earth. The British launched 4 major military expeditions against the dervishes between 1900 and 1904. Each one was supposed to be the final, decisive campaign. Each one failed. The first expedition, in 1900, marched into the interior with nearly 1,500 men, found the dervishes unwilling to stand and fight in the open, chased them across hundreds of miles of waterless scrubland, and returned having accomplished essentially nothing except exhausting its own men and animals. The second, in 1902, was larger and better equipped. It managed to bring the dervishes to battle at a place called Erigo, inflicted casualties, and declared victory. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan simply withdrew deeper into the interior, reorganized, and resumed operations within months. The third expedition, in 1903, involved coordination between British, Italian, and Abyssinian forces, a three-pronged pincer movement designed to trap the dervishes between converging armies. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan evaded all 3 prongs, melted into the terrain, and watched his pursuers exhaust themselves chasing ghosts. The fourth expedition, in 1904, ended with a negotiated agreement, essentially a ceasefire in which Britain gave Muhammad Abdullah Hassan a defined territory in the Ogaden, where he could settle his followers without further interference. The agreement was presented in London as a diplomatic solution. It was, more honestly, an acknowledgement that 4 military campaigns had failed to defeat him. The ceasefire lasted less than 4 years. What made Muhammad Abdullah Hassan so difficult to defeat was not just his tactical skill, though that was genuine. It was the nature of the movement he built, and at the centre of that movement was his poetry. Somali oral poetry, as we have established, was not decorative. It was functional, a technology of mass communication in a society without writing, capable of transmitting complex political and emotional content across vast distances with remarkable fidelity. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan was perhaps the greatest practitioner of this technology his culture had ever produced, and he used it with the deliberateness of a modern propagandist. His poems served multiple functions simultaneously. They rallied his followers by articulating the justice of their cause with a vividness and emotional force that no speech or sermon could match. They demoralized his enemies, both the colonial forces and the Somali clans who chose to cooperate with colonial authority, by subjecting them to withering, precisely targeted satirical attacks that spread through the oral networks faster than any official communication could respond to. They recruited new fighters by painting the struggle in terms that spoke directly to the deepest values of Somali culture: honour, independence, resistance to humiliation. One of his most famous compositions, directed at the Izark clans who collaborated with the British, is a masterpiece of savage irony. He describes the collaborators receiving British gifts and protection, then asks, in escalating detail, what exactly they think they have purchased with their dignity. The poem works on multiple levels at once, as political argument, as personal insult, as theological indictment, and as sheer aesthetic performance. British officers who had it translated for them reported being disturbed by its power, even in the necessarily inadequate English rendering. His poetry also reveals the genuine complexity of his own position. He was not a simple patriot burning with uncomplicated nationalist fire. He was a man of deep religious conviction, who sometimes struggled with the violence his movement required. He was a clan leader who needed the support of multiple clan groups, but who could never fully transcend the clan loyalties that divided Somali society even in the face of a common enemy. He was a visionary who could see, with clarity, what colonialism was doing to his people, and a tactician who sometimes made decisions, particularly regarding violence against Somali clans, he regarded as collaborators, that alienated potential allies and gave his enemies legitimate grievances to exploit. He was, in other words, a human being conducting an impossible struggle in impossible conditions, which is precisely what the label Mad Mullah was designed to obscure. After the failure of the 4 early expeditions, Britain largely adopted a policy of containment, attempting to limit the dervishes' freedom of movement and raiding without committing to another large-scale military campaign. The cost of those campaigns had been enormous in both money and men, and the British Treasury was not enthusiastic about repeating the exercise. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan used the relative breathing room of the next decade to consolidate his movement. He built a series of stone fortresses in the Ogaden and the Mudug region, the most impressive of which, at Tale in the interior of what is today northern Somalia, was a substantial fortified complex, built by local labour under his direction, capable of housing hundreds of fighters and storing significant quantities of supplies. These fortresses were a departure from the fluid, mobile guerrilla tactics that had served him so well in the early years of the war. They represented a shift toward permanence, toward the idea of establishing a dervish state, rather than simply conducting a resistance campaign. Whether this was strategic wisdom or a gradual loss of the mobility that had been his greatest military asset is a question historians still debate. What is not debated is what ended the war. In 1920, the British deployed airplanes. The Royal Air Force, newly independent as a service branch and anxious to demonstrate its usefulness in colonial policing, conducted a series of bombing raids on the dervish fortresses, beginning with Tale. The combination of aerial bombardment and a simultaneous ground offensive was devastating. The stone walls that had been built to withstand infantry assault were useless against bombs dropped from above. The dervish fighters, who had learned to evade columns of men on foot and on camel, had no answer for aircraft. The Tale fortress was destroyed. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan's camp was overrun. He escaped into the Ogaden with a remnant of his followers, but the movement was broken. Within months, he was dead, not in battle, but from influenza, somewhere in the Ogaden, sometime in late 1920. The exact date and location of his death remain uncertain, which seems somehow appropriate for a man whose entire life was conducted in defiance of the colonial administrative impulse to record and categorize everything. The war was over. It had lasted 21 years. The cost of those 21 years was staggering. and the accounting needs to be done honestly, because Muhammad Abdullah Hassan was not a simple hero, and his war was not a simple story of the righteous versus the wicked. The dervish movement killed Somali people, many Somali people. The clans that refused to join the movement, particularly the Isaac clans of the British Protectorate, many of whom actively supported the colonial forces, suffered devastating raids in which livestock was seized, men were killed, and communities were destroyed. The dervishes operated with a ferocity that did not distinguish cleanly between colonial collaborators and ordinary people who simply wanted to live their lives without being conscripted into a war they had not chosen. Contemporary estimates of the total Somali dead over the course of the 21-year war, from combat, from the famines that the disruption of pastoral life inevitably caused, from the reprisals of all sides, range into the hundreds of thousands. The northern Somali population was reduced, by some estimates, by perhaps a third over this period. The livestock herds that were the foundation of pastoral life were devastated. Entire communities were displaced. The social fabric of the protectorate was torn in ways that took generations to repair. This is the shadow side of the dervish legacy, and Somali historical memory holds both sides in uncomfortable tension. Muhammad Abdullah Hassan is a national hero. His face appeared on Somali currency. The National Theatre in Mogadishu bore his name, and every Somali schoolchild of the post-colonial era learned his poems as part of the cultural canon. And simultaneously, the descendants of the Isaac clans who suffered most from dervish raids have their own, considerably less celebratory version of the same history. What cannot be disputed is the significance of what he accomplished. For 21 years, one man with a camel army kept 3 empires from fully subduing a people. He demonstrated, in practice and in poetry, that Somali resistance was possible, that colonial authority was not inevitable, that the lines drawn on European maps were not the last word on the matter. He also demonstrated something darker, that the clan divisions that the colonial powers exploited would not disappear simply because a common enemy was present. The same fractures that made it impossible for the Somali people to form a unified political response to colonial partition also made it impossible for Muhammad Abdullah Hassan to build a truly national resistance movement. His dervishes were always primarily a Darod and Ogaden clan enterprise, viewed with suspicion or outright hostility by significant portions of the Somali population. That pattern, the pattern of a cause that was right, and a movement that was limited by the very clan structures it could not transcend, would repeat itself, with variations. Through every subsequent chapter of Somali political history, the British buried the memory of this war as quickly as they could. 4 failed expeditions against a man they called mad was not the kind of history that imperial administrations like to commemorate. In Somalia itself, the memory was buried differently, kept alive in poetry, in oral tradition, in the name of the man who refused, for 21 years, to accept that his homeland belonged to someone else. His camels are gone, his fortress is rubble, his poems are still recited. Chapter 5. Under 4 Flags. Life inside colonial Somalia. When the Dervish War ended in 1920, the British held a celebration in Berbera. There were speeches, there were toasts. The officers of the Somaliland Camel Corps, the local force that had done most of the actual fighting while the Royal Air Force got most of the credit, stood in the heat and listened to proclamations about the triumph of civilization over fanaticism. And then, with the celebration concluded and the Mad Mullah safely dead, Britain did what it had always done with British Somaliland, as little as possible. The protectorate budget was cut. The small administrative staff was reduced further. Plans for schools, roads and agricultural development, never ambitious to begin with, were quietly shelved. The official position in London remained what it had been since 1887. British Somaliland existed to protect Aden, and Aden existed to protect the route to India, and the route to India was the point of the entire exercise. Somalia itself was incidental. This was, in the bluntest terms, the colonial experience of northern Somalia. 40 years of deliberate neglect, interrupted by occasional bursts of violent suppression, administered by a government that regarded the territory as a burden rather than an opportunity, and that invested in it accordingly. When a British official in the 1940s described British Somaliland as the Cinderella of the colonial empire, he was not being metaphorical. He meant that it had been systematically starved of resources while its more glamorous imperial siblings received all the attention. The southern story, Italian Somalia, was different in its details and similar in its essential cruelty. And between these two colonial experiences, the Somali people were being shaped, in ways they could not yet fully see, into the nation they would become. Italy's approach to its Somali territory went through several distinct phases, each reflecting the political mood in Rome rather than any coherent understanding of the land or people being governed. In the earliest phase, the Italian government essentially subcontracted the administration of the Benadir coast, the stretch of southern Somali coastline centered on Mogadishu, to a series of private chartered companies. These companies were given commercial monopolies in exchange for taking on the administrative costs that Rome did not want to pay directly. The arrangement satisfied neither party. The companies found it difficult to make money from a territory with limited resources and a population deeply resistant to the kind of settled agricultural labour that commercial exploitation required. The local Somali population found the company administrators venal, arbitrary, and violent. The transition to direct government administration in the early 20th century did not immediately improve matters. The southern Somali sultans, particularly the Majeerteen Sultanate in the northeast and the Hobyo Sultanate further south, had initially accepted Italian protection under agreements that they understood as commercial partnerships. When Italian administrators began asserting actual governmental authority, imposing taxes, interfering with traditional governance, and overriding the Sultan's judicial powers, the result was armed resistance. The Majeerteen rebellion of the 1900s and the subsequent resistance of the Hobyo sultans were suppressed with considerable brutality. The sultanates were dismantled, their leaders were exiled or imprisoned. The message was clear: the partnership phase was over. Italy was not a commercial partner, it was a colonial power, and it intended to govern accordingly. The most consequential Italian intervention in southern Somalia was the development of plantation agriculture in the inter-riverine zone, the fertile strip between the Shebel and Juba rivers that had been, for centuries, the most productive agricultural land in the entire Somali territory. Italian entrepreneurs, backed by government concessions and government encouragement, began establishing large banana plantations along the Shebel River in the 1920s. The banana trade became the centerpiece of Italian Somalia's export economy. Mogadishu's port was developed largely to handle banana shipments, and the infrastructure that Italy built in the south was oriented overwhelmingly toward getting bananas from plantation to ship as efficiently as possible. The labor problem was severe and was solved in ways that the colonial administration would later prefer not to discuss in detail. The nomadic Somali clans of the interior, the Darod, the Hawiye, the Isaaq, regarded agricultural labour as beneath them. This was not laziness. It was a deeply held cultural position rooted in the pastoral value system that ranked the camel herder above the farmer in the Somali social hierarchy. No amount of financial inducement could reliably convince nomadic clan members to abandon their herds and work on an Italian plantation. The settled agricultural communities of the inter-riverine zone, primarily the Digil and Rahanwain clans, and the Somali Bantu communities along the rivers, were more familiar with farming, but they were already farming their own land on their own terms and had limited incentive to become wage labourers for foreign plantation owners when they could feed themselves from their own fields. The solution, adopted with the quiet encouragement of Italian administrators, was coercion. Labour recruiters were sent to the Baidoa and Burhakaba regions to conscript workers. Men were brought to the plantations under conditions that differed from forced labour primarily in the paperwork that accompanied them. The memory of this period, of men taken from their families and their land to work for foreign masters who paid them poorly and treated them worse, embedded itself in the Somali consciousness of the South so deeply that it was still being cited, decades later, as evidence of why foreign interference in Somali affairs could never be trusted. The Duke of Abruzzi, a member of the Italian royal family who established a model agricultural venture on the Shebel River, was celebrated in Italian colonial propaganda as an example of enlightened development, bringing modern agricultural techniques and commercial organisation to a backward territory. From the perspective of the Somali workers on his estate, the experience was less enlightening. The contract labour system, the company housing, the dependency on the plantation owner's goodwill for access to basic necessities, these were the material conditions of an exploitative relationship dressed up in the language of progress. Despite the coercive foundations of Italian Somalia's agricultural economy, Italian colonial administration did leave physical infrastructure that would outlast the colonial period. Under Governor Cesare De Vecchi in the 1920s and his successors, Italian Somalia received road construction, hospital building, and the development of Mogadishu as a genuine urban centre with government buildings, a port, and the beginnings of a modern city. The Italians built small schools, primarily oriented toward teaching Italian language and producing a class of Somalis who could serve as lower-level administrative staff, and established basic health services in the major towns. A small railway connecting the plantation zones to Mogadishu was constructed. Geological surveys began, probing for the mineral resources that Italian planners hoped might supplement the banana economy. Salt production facilities were established on the northern coast, eventually producing hundreds of thousands of tons for export annually. These investments were not altruistic. They were the infrastructure of extraction, built to facilitate the movement of goods from Somali territory to Italian markets, to maintain a minimal level of public health that kept the labour force functional, and to demonstrate to the international community that Italy was a serious colonial power engaged in the civilizing mission that European imperial ideology demanded as justification for the whole enterprise. The Somali people who lived within this system were not passive recipients of Italian development. They worked in the administration, they traded in the markets, they adapted their economic activities to take advantage of the commercial opportunities that colonial trade created. Some Somali merchants built genuine prosperity within the colonial economy. Some Somali men who attended Italian schools acquired educations that would later serve them in the independence movement and the early post-colonial government. But the fundamental terms of the relationship were not negotiated. They were imposed, and the accumulated experience of that imposition, the confiscated lands, the forced labour, the humiliating social hierarchy that placed the least competent Italian administrator above the most capable Somali elder, was deposited in Somali collective memory like sediment, layer by layer, year by year, shaping the political consciousness that would eventually demand independence. Then the Second World War arrived, and it scrambled the board entirely. In June 1940, Mussolini's Italy entered the war on the side of Nazi Germany. Almost immediately, Italian forces in East Africa, which included not just Italian Somalia, but also Italian Eritrea and Italian-occupied Abyssinia, launched an offensive against British-held territories. British Somaliland, that neglected protectorate that Britain had never invested in or defended seriously, fell to the Italian advance in August 940 inches, less than 3 weeks. For a brief, strange moment, all of Somalia, British and Italian, was under a single administration. The Italian flag flew over Berbera. The British had retreated across the Gulf of Aden to Aden. It was the only time in the colonial period when the artificial division of Somalia had been, however inadvertently, reversed. It lasted less than a year. In early 1941, British forces, including substantial contingents from South Africa, India, and East Africa, launched a counter-offensive across the entire East African theatre. By April 1941, Italian resistance had collapsed. The Duke of Aosta, commanding Italian forces in East Africa, surrendered at Amba Alagi in May. The British were back in Berbera. And now, for the first time, a British administration was in charge of the entire Somali coast, both the former British protectorate and the former Italian territory. For the Somali people, this moment was genuinely significant. For the first time in living memory, the artificial border between northern and southern Somalia had effectively ceased to exist. British administrators were governing the whole territory as a de facto unit. Somali politicians in both regions began talking to each other in ways the colonial border had previously made difficult. The idea of a unified Somalia, always present as a dream, suppressed by the practical reality of colonial division, began to feel, for the first time, like something that might actually be possible. When the Second World War ended in 1945, the question of what to do with Italy's former colonies fell to the victorious powers. Italy had lost the war. Italian Somalia, Italian Eritrea, and Italian Libya were no longer Italian. But what were they to become? A four-power commission, Britain, the United States, France, and the Soviet Union, spent several years attempting to reach agreement on the disposition of the Italian colonies. Somalia was among the most contested cases precisely because the question of its future intersected with the broader question of Somali unification that the war had brought to the surface. The British administration in Mogadishu, under the influence of administrators who had actually spent time in Somalia and developed some sympathy for Somali political aspirations, proposed what became known as the Bevin Plan, named for British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin. The Bevin Plan proposed uniting British Somaliland, Italian Somalia, and the Ethiopian Ogaden into a single trust territory under international supervision with a view to eventual self-governance. It was, in conception, the most serious attempt by any great power to address the fundamental injustice of Somalia's colonial partition. It was rejected. The United States was not interested in offending Ethiopia, which it regarded as a strategically important ally in the emerging Cold War. The Soviet Union was opposed to anything that strengthened British influence in the region. France was uncomfortable with any precedent for redrawing colonial borders. The Bevin Plan died in committee. What emerged instead was a compromise. Italian Somalia would be placed under United Nations trusteeship, administered by Italy, the very colonial power that had just been expelled, for a period of 10 years, at the end of which independence would follow. British Somaliland would remain a British protectorate. The Ogaden would be returned to Ethiopia. The Northern Frontier District would remain in Kenya. The partition, in other words, was confirmed. The Somali people had come closer to unity than at any point since the colonial carve-up, and the moment had passed. The lines drawn in the 1880s were redrawn in the late 1940s, with minor adjustments and a new vocabulary of trusteeship and international supervision, but the same fundamental structure: one people, multiple states, borders that served everyone's interests except Somalia's own. Through all of this, the Italian plantation economy, the British neglect, the wartime disruption, the post-war diplomatic manoeuvring, a generation of Somali political consciousness was forming. The key institution was the Somali Youth League, founded in Mogadishu in 1943, initially under the careful observation of the British military administration. The founders were young, educated Somalis, men who had attended colonial schools, worked in colonial administrations, learned enough Italian or English to understand the political world their people inhabited, and concluded that the time for waiting and enduring was ending. The Somali Youth League was the first genuinely pan-Somali political organisation. It explicitly rejected clan-based politics, demanded the unification of all Somali territories, and advocated for independence through political means. At its founding, its 13 members represented all the major Somali clan families, a deliberate statement that this was a national movement, not a clan project. Within a few years, the League had tens of thousands of members across both British and Italian Somalia, and branches that extended clandestinely into the Ogaden and the Northern Frontier District. It ran newspapers, organised meetings, trained political cadres, and built the organisational infrastructure of a national movement at a speed that surprised even sympathetic observers. The Somali Youth League did not produce independence on its own. The timeline of independence was determined by international negotiations far above its reach, but it created the political culture, the organisational forms, and the leadership class from which the independent Somali state would be built. When independence came, it would come to a people who had been preparing for it, at least in some parts of their society, for nearly 2 decades. The preparation was real. The question was whether it was sufficient. Because the independent Somalia that was taking shape in the minds of its founders was a nation defined by the aspiration to unity, unity of the divided Somali territories, unity across the clan divisions that had limited every previous attempt at collective action, unity of purpose in building something genuinely new in the Horn of Africa. And the world they were about to inherit was one in which every structural feature of their situation, the colonial borders, the clan system, the economic underdevelopment, the Cold War competition that was already beginning to reshape global politics, was pushing powerfully in the opposite direction. The flag was almost ready to be raised. The ground beneath it was already cracking. Chapter 6: Independence and its Betrayal. The Birth and Death of Somali Democracy. On the 1st of July 1960, 2 flags came down and 1 went up. In Mogadishu, the Italian tricolour was lowered over the buildings of the Trust Territory Administration. In Berbera, the British Union Jack was folded away for the last time. And over both cities, simultaneously, the new flag of the Somali Republic rose, light blue, with a single white star at its centre. Each of the star's 5 points representing one of the 5 Somali territories that the new nation aspired, eventually, to unite. The crowds in Mogadishu were enormous. People danced in the streets through the night. Poets composed and performed on every corner. Old men wept. Children who had grown up knowing nothing but colonial rule stood in the warm Indian Ocean night and tried to comprehend what it meant that the country was, for the first time in living memory, their own. It was, by any measure, a genuine moment of hope. Somalia was one of the few African countries to achieve independence with a functioning parliamentary system already in place, a trained civil service, a political party with genuine mass support, and a national language spoken by virtually the entire population. The Somali Youth League, the organisation that had spent 17 years building toward this moment, was positioned to lead the new state with democratic legitimacy and organisational capacity. And here is the thing that makes the next decade so painful to examine. For a while, it actually worked. For a while, Somalia was a democracy. A real one, contentious, chaotic, sometimes corrupt, but genuinely competitive, genuinely representative, and capable of producing peaceful transfers of power through the ballot box. And then, with a speed that should have been impossible for a country with so much going for it, the whole thing collapsed. Understanding how requires understanding the one structural flaw that independence could not fix, the flaw that colonialism had left behind like a splinter buried too deep to remove, and that the new Somali state had neither the time nor the tools to extract before it turned septic. The independent Somali Republic was formed by the union of two territories that had spent 70 years developing in different directions under different colonial masters. British Somaliland, in the north, had a smaller population, a more pastoral economy, and a political culture shaped by the relatively hands-off British administrative style, which had left clan-based governance structures largely intact while developing only a thin layer of modern political institutions. Italian Somalia, in the south, had a larger population, a more developed urban economy centered on Mogadishu, and a political culture shaped by the more interventionist Italian approach, which had created a larger educated class, more institutional infrastructure, and a more competitive multi-party political environment. The union of these two territories was rushed. The British Somaliland Protectorate had only achieved independence 5 days before the Trust Territory, on the 26th of June 1960, and the merger was executed in days rather than months, driven by the nationalist conviction that delay would be betrayal. There was no detailed constitutional negotiation about how the two systems would be integrated, how power would be distributed between North and South, or how the different administrative traditions would be reconciled. This haste planted the first seeds of the resentment that would eventually, 3 decades later, cause the North to break away entirely. The constitutional framework that the new republic adopted was parliamentary, a National Assembly of 123 members, elected by universal adult suffrage, from which a Prime Minister and Cabinet would be drawn, accountable to the legislature. The President was a largely ceremonial figure, elected by the Assembly rather than directly by the people. On paper, this was a reasonable system. In practice, it interacted with the specific realities of Somali political culture in ways that produced outcomes nobody had fully anticipated. Here is the central paradox of Somali democratic politics in the 1960s. The Somali Youth League, the dominant party, had been founded on an explicit rejection of clan-based politics. Its founders were genuine nationalists who believed that the clan system, with its fracturing loyalties, its demands for intra-group solidarity over national solidarity, its tendency to reduce every political question to a calculation of clan advantage, was the primary obstacle to building a unified Somali nation. The party's founding documents specifically prohibited clan-based appeals and demanded that candidates be evaluated on their qualifications and policies rather than their lineage. And then the party won elections in a society where virtually every voter's primary political identity was their clan membership, where the decision of which candidate to support was inseparable from the question of which lineage group that candidate represented, and where a politician who delivered resources to his clan community was considered to have done his job regardless of what it cost the national treasury. The result was not a failure of democracy. It was democracy working exactly as designed, aggregating the preferences of the electorate, translating those preferences into political representation, producing governments that reflected the actual balance of political forces in the society. The problem was that the actual balance of political forces in Somali society was organised primarily along clan lines, and no constitutional provision or nationalist rhetoric could change that in the space of a single electoral cycle. By the mid-1960s, the Somali National Assembly had fragmented into a bewildering multiplicity of factions. The Somali Youth League, theoretically dominant, was itself internally divided along clan lines, with different sub-factions representing different clan coalitions, jockeying for control of cabinet posts and government resources. The opposition parties that had emerged to challenge the League were similarly structured, less political parties in the programmatic sense than vehicles for organising clan coalitions around electoral competition. The number of parties that contested the 1,964 elections was over 20. The number that contested the 1,969 elections was over 60. Each new party represented, at its core, a clan or sub-clan group that had decided it could extract better terms from the political system by competing independently than by remaining within an existing coalition. This proliferation was not irrational from the perspective of individual clan groups. It was perfectly rational. If your clan had 10,000 voters in a district, and you could run your own candidate rather than supporting a candidate from a dominant clan who might or might not remember your interests after the election, running your own candidate made obvious sense. The problem was that the sum of all these individually rational decisions produced a political system that was increasingly ungovernable. Coalition governments in this environment were inherently unstable. A prime minister who needed a majority in a 1-2-3 seat assembly, drawn from 60 competing parties, had to construct his coalition by offering cabinet positions and government contracts to a sufficient number of clan faction leaders to assemble the votes he needed. Cabinet size expanded accordingly, not because the government needed more ministers, but because every coalition partner needed a ministry as the price of their support. Government contracts flowed to the businesses and communities of the politicians who controlled the relevant ministries. Civil service appointments were distributed as patronage to the lineage groups of ruling coalition members. The distinction between public resources and clan resources became, in practice, almost impossible to maintain. This was not uniquely Somali. Patronage politics, the use of public office to reward supporters, the conversion of government resources into political currency. These are features of political systems across the world, particularly in newly independent states with weak institutions and strong traditional social structures. The Somali version was not more corrupt than comparable systems in many other countries. What made it politically dangerous in Somalia was the combination of its scale, its visibility, and the specific cultural framework, the clan system, within which it operated. When a Kenyan or a Nigerian politician steered contracts to his home district, the connection between the corruption and a specific ethnic or regional identity was present but diffuse. When a Somali politician directed resources to his lineage group, the connection was direct, specific, and immediately legible to everyone in the society. Every act of patronage was simultaneously a statement about which clan was winning and which was losing, and in a society organised around clan competition, that statement had implications that radiated far beyond the immediate transaction. By the late 1960s, Somali public discourse was saturated with cynicism about the parliamentary system. The National Assembly, Assemblea Nazionale, in the Italian-influenced formal vocabulary of the South, had acquired a street-level nickname in Mogadishu. A.N. had been reinterpreted as Anna Nolabe, roughly, "I'm fine, never mind the others." The joke captured, with the precision that Somali humour has always brought to political observation, exactly what had gone wrong. Democracy had become a mechanism for individual and clan advancement, dressed up in the language of national interest. Intellectuals and opposition politicians began talking openly about the need for strong leadership, for a government that could cut through the clan factionalism and impose national discipline in the service of development. Military officers, who had their own institutional grievances about pay, promotion, and the civilian government's management of the national defence, listened to this talk and drew their own conclusions. While the parliamentary system was consuming itself from within, the Somali government was also managing an external ambition that was simultaneously the country's most powerful source of national unity and its most dangerous political liability. The five-pointed star on the Somali flag was not merely decorative, it was a map and a manifesto. 5 points for 5 Somali territories: the former British Somaliland, the former Italian Somalia, the Ogaden under Ethiopian rule, the Northern Frontier District under Kenyan rule, and French Somaliland, today's Djibouti. The Somali constitution explicitly committed the state to the eventual reunification of all Somali inhabited territories, a commitment that made every neighbouring government view Somalia as a permanent territorial threat. Relations with Ethiopia were poisonous from the start. The Ogaden, that vast plateau of Somali pastoralists living under Ethiopian sovereignty since Menelik's 1897 agreement with Britain, was the central grievance. Somali governments provided support, sometimes openly and sometimes covertly, to Ogaden clan resistance movements that periodically flared into armed conflict with Ethiopian security forces. Ethiopia responded by supporting Somali clan groups that were hostile to the government in Mogadishu. The border region was in a state of chronic low-level warfare throughout the 1960s, punctuated by a more serious conflict in 1964 that came close to full-scale war before a ceasefire was brokered. Relations with Kenya were similarly tense. The Northern Frontier District, overwhelmingly Somali in population, had voted, in a British-organised consultation before Kenyan independence, overwhelmingly for union with Somalia, rather than incorporation into the new Kenyan state. Britain ignored the vote and handed the territory to Kenya anyway, a decision driven by the same calculus that had characterised British policy towards Somali interests for a century. Somali preferences were less important than the stability of the regional arrangements that British policy required. The Northern Frontier District then erupted into a guerrilla insurgency, the Shifter War, as Somali clan fighters resisted Kenyan authority. The war dragged on through the mid-1960s, draining both Kenyan and Somali resources and generating exactly the kind of regional hostility that made it impossible for Somalia to build the normal diplomatic relationships that a newly independent state needed. The dream of Greater Somalia was real, and it was genuinely popular. A survey of Somali public opinion at any point in the 1960s would have found overwhelming support for the principle of unifying the divided territories. But the pursuit of that dream imposed costs that the young republic could barely afford: military expenditure, diplomatic isolation, regional enemies, and a political culture in which nationalist rhetoric about Somali unity was used to distract attention from the failure to build effective governance within the borders the republic actually controlled. By 1969, the parliamentary system was exhausted. The elections of March that year produced a result that illustrated the problem with almost comic precision. 64 political parties contested the vote. The Somali Youth League won a majority, but the majority was built from such a complex coalition of competing clan factions that governing with it was barely possible. Losing candidates filed hundreds of legal challenges. The Supreme Court ruled that it lacked jurisdiction to hear them, a ruling that seemed designed primarily to avoid the political consequences of actually adjudicating the disputes. Prime Minister Mohammed Haji Ibrahim Egal, a capable politician from the Azak clan of the north, was navigating this chaos with considerable skill but diminishing returns. He knew the system was broken. He had said so privately to people he trusted. He was not sure what to replace it with. On the 15th of October 1969, President Abdirashid Ali Sharmaka was shot dead by his own bodyguard in the northern town of Lasanod. The motive was personal, a local grievance, not a political conspiracy, but the effect was political earthquake. Egal rushed back from a foreign trip to manage the succession crisis, convening party leaders to select a new president. In the early hours of the 21st of October 1969, the army moved. Military units took up positions around key government buildings in Mogadishu before dawn. The Prime Minister, cabinet ministers, and other senior political figures were arrested in their homes. The Constitution was suspended, the National Assembly was dissolved, the Supreme Court was abolished, all political parties were declared illegal, and a new governing body, the Supreme Revolutionary Council, was announced, composed of military officers under the chairmanship of Major General Mohammed Siad Barre, commander of the National Army. The coup was bloodless. Nobody fired a shot in defence of the parliamentary system. This absence of resistance was itself significant. The military takeover of October 1969 did not have to fight its way to power, because the political class it displaced had, by that point, so thoroughly exhausted public trust that even those who feared what military rule might bring could summon little energy to resist it. The streets of Mogadishu did not erupt in protest, In many neighborhoods, people simply watched and waited, and some, particularly the young, the educated, the frustrated, felt something that they were almost ashamed to recognize as relief. A new era had begun. It announced itself with the language of revolution, of scientific socialism, of national renewal and anti-clan unity. It promised everything the parliamentary system had failed to deliver. It would take Somalia somewhere the parliamentary system, for all its failures, had never threatened to go. Chapter 7. The Ogaden Gamble. Cold War Chess on African Soil. There is a moment in this story that works like a hinge. Before it, Somalia is a country with serious problems, a military dictatorship, a fragile economy, the unresolved wound of the divided Somali territories, but it is a country that still has a future. After it, the future begins to close, not all at once, not visibly in the immediate aftermath, but with the terrible inevitability of a structure whose load-bearing wall has been removed. Everything still looks like it's standing, and then it isn't. That moment is the Ogaden War of 1977 to 1978, and to understand why a single military campaign, lasting less than a year, could set in motion the complete destruction of a state, you need to understand the world in which it happened. A world in which the Horn of Africa had become a Cold War chessboard, and the superpowers were playing a game in which African lives were the pieces they moved and discarded without sentiment. But first, you need to understand the man who made the gamble. Mohammed Siad Barre was 60 years old when he seized power in October 1969. Though the exact year of his birth was uncertain even to him, a not uncommon situation for a man born to a nomadic pastoral family in the Ogaden, before anyone was counting or recording such things with precision. He was a career military officer, methodical and patient, who had risen through the colonial police force and then the post-colonial national army to its highest rank. He was a Darod, specifically from the Marahan subclan, and the clan arithmetic of his power base would ultimately define and destroy his rule. But in 1969, the clan dimension of his politics was carefully concealed behind a vocabulary borrowed from the global left. The Supreme Revolutionary Council announced that Somalia would be governed according to the principles of scientific socialism, a Somali variant, Barre was careful to specify, rooted in Islamic values and Somali cultural traditions, rather than atheist, Marxist orthodoxy. In practice, this meant a one-party state, a command economy, the nationalization of major businesses, a cult of personality organized around Barre himself, whom the state media began calling a Fwain. Big Mouth, a nickname he apparently embraced, and a genuine, determined program of social reform in areas where reform was both needed and politically useful. The most dramatic of these reforms was the introduction of a written Somali script in 1972. This was not a minor administrative decision, it was a cultural revolution. The Somali language had never had a standardized written form, or rather, it had had competing proposed scripts that various scholars and political figures had advocated over the decades, without ever reaching consensus. Barre's government cut through the debate by decree, adopted a script based on the Latin alphabet, and immediately launched a mass literacy campaign of extraordinary ambition. Within 2 years, literacy teams had fanned out across the country, teaching the new script to urban workers, to soldiers, to school children. In 1974 and 1975, thousands of secondary school students and urban youth were sent into the rural interior, into the pastoral communities that had always been the most isolated from formal education, to teach nomadic families to read and write, their own language for the first time. The campaign was coercive in its organisation and imperfect in its execution, but it was also genuinely transformative. Literacy rates climbed. The oral tradition that had been Somalia's primary cultural technology for millennia now had a written complement. The regime also attacked the clan system, at least rhetorically, with unusual directness. Clan identity was officially prohibited in public discourse. The traditional clan titles were banned. Tribalism, as the government called it, was declared the enemy of the revolution. Citizens were instructed to address each other as Jal, comrade, rather than by formulations that encoded clan identity. Clan elders who had been the traditional authorities in rural communities were sidelined, their customary judicial functions taken over by state-appointed officials. In the early years, this combination of genuine social reform, nationalist rhetoric, and authoritarian discipline produced real results. Development indicators improved, roads were built. The 1974 drought, which devastated pastoral communities across the Sahel in one of the worst climate disasters of the 20th century, was managed with a degree of organizational competence that earned international recognition. Hundreds of thousands of nomadic families affected by the drought were relocated to agricultural and fishing settlements in a massive program that was simultaneously humanitarian relief and social engineering. Internationally, Barre was playing a sophisticated game. He positioned Somalia as a non-aligned state, cultivating relationships with both superpowers, accepting aid from Moscow and Washington simultaneously, and using the competition between them to maximize the resources flowing into his government. The Soviet Union, particularly attracted by Somalia's strategic position at the mouth of the Red Sea, provided military equipment and advisors on a significant scale through the early 1970s. The Americans, watching with concern as Soviet influence expanded in the region, maintained their own relationship with Mogadishu as a hedge. Barre understood that he was a piece on a larger board, and he thought, in 1977, that he had found a way to use the board to his advantage. The opportunity, or what looked like an opportunity, arrived from Ethiopia. In September 1974, Emperor Haile Selassie, who had ruled Ethiopia since 1930, was deposed by a military committee called the Derg. The emperor was an old man by then, increasingly out of touch, presiding over a country devastated by famine in the north while his government tried to suppress news of the disaster. The coup that removed him was not a single decisive act, but the beginning of a prolonged, chaotic, and extremely violent political struggle within Ethiopia itself. The Derg, a Marxist military junta, began a program of revolutionary transformation that quickly descended into what became known as the Red Terror, a systematic campaign of political violence against perceived opponents, in which tens of thousands of Ethiopians were killed. The country was in turmoil. The army was demoralized. The provincial periphery, including the Ogaden, was in various stages of rebellion against central authority. From Mogadishu, Siad Barre watched all of this with the focused attention of a man who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Ogaden had been a wound in Somali national consciousness since 1897. The Somali-inhabited plateau, handed to Abyssinia by a British treaty the Somali people had never accepted, had never been fully pacified by Ethiopian authority. A Somali insurgent organisation, the Western Somali Liberation Front, had been operating in the Ogaden for years, fighting Ethiopian garrisons with weapons and support that flowed, covertly, from Mogadishu. Now the Ethiopian state appeared to be collapsing. The Derg was fighting enemies on multiple fronts. The Ogaden was largely undefended, and the dream that had been encoded in the 5 points of the Somali Star, the dream of reuniting the divided Somali territories, seemed, for the first time since independence, to be within actual military reach. Barre made his decision. In July 1977, the Somali National Army crossed the Ethiopian border into the Ogaden in force. The campaign's initial success was stunning. Somali forces, equipped with Soviet tanks and artillery accumulated over a decade of Soviet military assistance, swept through the Ogaden with a speed that caught the Ethiopians entirely off guard. Within weeks, Somali troops had captured most of the major towns in the region. By September, they controlled approximately 90% of the Ogaden Plateau. The ancient walled city of Harar, the great Muslim centre that had been the target of Ahmad Gran's 16th century jihad, was within artillery range of the advancing Somali forces. It looked, for a brief and intoxicating moment, like victory. Then the world shifted underneath Siad Barre's feet. What happened next was one of the most dramatic geopolitical reversals of the Cold War era, executed with a cynicism so breathtaking that it deserves to be examined closely, because it tells you everything about the relationship between African states and the superpowers who claim to be their allies. The Soviet Union had been Somalia's primary military patron for most of the decade. Soviet advisors were embedded in the Somali military. Soviet weapons had equipped the army that was now fighting in the Ogaden. The relationship between Mogadishu and Moscow had been the cornerstone of Somali defense policy since the early 1970s. And then the Soviet Union decided that Ethiopia was more valuable than Somalia. The calculation was coldly strategic. Ethiopia had a population of perhaps 35 million people, compared to Somalia's 5 million. It had a larger economy, more agricultural resources, and a more significant position in African politics. The Derg's Marxist orientation made it, in Soviet calculations, a more ideologically congenial ally than Barre's eclectic scientific socialism. And from a purely military perspective, Ethiopian territory offered basing options and strategic depth that Somalia simply could not match. In late 1977, the Soviet Union switched sides. Soviet military advisors in Somalia were withdrawn. Soviet arms shipments to Mogadishu stopped. And simultaneously, a massive Soviet airlift and sea lift began delivering weapons, ammunition, and military equipment to Ethiopia, the country that Somali forces were actively fighting. Cuban combat troops, thousands of them, were airlifted to Ethiopia to supplement the reconstituting Ethiopian army. Soviet generals advised the Ethiopian High Command on operational planning. The entire weight of Soviet military support, which had spent a decade building the Somali army, was now turned against that army. Barre flew to Moscow to appeal personally to Soviet leadership. He was received with courtesy and told in essence that the decision had been made. He flew to Washington to appeal to the Americans. The Carter administration, genuinely sympathetic but constrained by its own policy commitments and its reluctance to be seen supporting an invasion of a neighbouring country, offered only limited assistance. Barre was trapped. The superpower patron he had built his military on had defected. The alternative superpower patron was unwilling to fully replace it, and his army was in the field against an enemy that was now receiving the full weight of Soviet and Cuban military support. The Ethiopian counteroffensive, when it came in early 1978, was overwhelming. Cuban armoured units and reconstituted Ethiopian forces pushed the Somali army back across the Ogaden with a speed that mirrored the initial Somali advance. By March 1978, it was over. Somali forces withdrew across the border. The Ogaden was back in Ethiopian hands. The dream of Greater Somalia had come closer to realization than ever before in the independence era, and then collapsed completely in the space of a few months. The military defeat itself was devastating enough. Thousands of Somali soldiers were dead. The army's equipment, tanks, artillery, aircraft, accumulated over a decade of Soviet assistance, was largely destroyed or abandoned. The national treasury had been emptied to fund the campaign. And a massive flood of refugees, ethnic Somalis from the Ogaden, who had supported the Somali advance and now fled the Ethiopian counteroffensive, poured across the border into Somalia, adding hundreds of thousands of desperate, traumatized people to a country that was already struggling to feed and govern itself. But the military defeat was only the most visible dimension of a much deeper catastrophe. The Ogaden War exposed the fundamental fragility of the Barre regime. The authority that Barre had constructed through a combination of genuine reform, nationalist rhetoric, and careful clan balancing depended, ultimately, on the promise of delivery, on the sense that the revolution was going somewhere, that the sacrifices it demanded were investments in a future that would arrive. The Ogaden adventure had been the ultimate expression of that promise, the actual physical reunification of the divided Somali nation. When it failed, the promise collapsed with it. And without the promise, what remained was the machinery of authoritarian control, the secret police, the arbitrary detentions, the clan-based patronage network, stripped of the ideological clothing that had given it legitimacy. Barre's response to the failure was to tighten rather than loosen his grip. Political dissent, always risky in his Somalia, became actively dangerous. The secret police, the NSS, the National Security Service, expanded its operations. Clan politics, which Barre had rhetorically suppressed but always used instrumentally, became more nakedly central to the regime's survival strategy. He began relying more heavily on his own Marahan clan and its allied Darud subclans, the so-called MOD alliance of Marahan, Ogaden, and Dulbahante, to staff the military and security services, while increasingly marginalizing other clan groups from positions of real power. This was the beginning of the end, though it would take more than a decade for the end to arrive. Through the early 1980s, armed opposition groups began forming in the regions where Barre's clan politics had produced the deepest alienation. The most significant was the Somali National Movement, founded in 1981 primarily by members of the Azark clan, the dominant group in the north, in former British Somaliland. who had felt marginalized in the post-colonial political system and were now experiencing the additional indignity of deliberate exclusion from the Barre regime's patronage networks. The Somali national movement established bases in Ethiopia, with the active support of the Ethiopian government, which was happy to return the favour of Somalia's long support for Ogaden rebels, and began conducting guerrilla operations in the north. Barre's response was the response of a man who had learned, from the Ogaden failure, that he could not afford to appear weak. The army was sent into the north with instructions to suppress the rebellion by whatever means necessary. What the army did in the north, through the mid and late 1980s, crossed from counterinsurgency into atrocity. The city of Hargeisa, the largest city in the former British Somaliland, the regional capital of the north, was systematically shelled and bombed by government aircraft and artillery. Entire neighbourhoods were destroyed. Civilians were killed in numbers that human rights organisations, when they were finally able to investigate, described as a deliberate campaign of collective punishment against the Azark population. Hundreds of thousands of people fled across the border into Ethiopia. The Hargeisa massacre, and it deserves to be called that, was the moment when the Barre regime lost any remaining claim to represent the Somali nation. A government that bombed its own second city, that drove hundreds of thousands of its own citizens into refugee camps across the border, had dissolved whatever social contract had existed between the state and the people. By 1990, the regime was fighting multiple armed opposition groups across the country. The economy had collapsed. The foreign aid that had sustained it through the 1980s was drying up as international donors, increasingly aware of the regime's human rights record, reduced their support. The army was demoralised, underpaid, and increasingly organised along clan lines rather than national ones. Mogadishu itself was becoming a battleground, and the Cold War, which had made Barre's Somalia strategically significant to the superpowers, was ending. The Soviet Union was dissolving. The United States was losing interest in the regional proxy conflicts that had driven its engagement in the Horn of Africa. The superpower attention that had sustained, armed, and ultimately helped destroy the Somali state was moving on to other theatres. Somalia was being left alone with what the Cold War had made of it. The gamble of 1977 had taken a country with real problems and a possible future, and turned it into a country with a broken army, an empty treasury, a traumatised population, and a government that had abandoned any pretense of national governance in favour of raw clan-based survival. The hinge had turned, the structure was falling, and the worst was still to come. Chapter 8. The Fall: How a Nation Ate Itself Alive. In January 1991, Mohammed Siad Barre fled Mogadishu in a tank, not metaphorically. An actual tank, rolling through the streets of the capital he had ruled for 21 years, pursued by militia fighters who wanted him dead. He escaped south, into the interior, gathering remnants of his Marahan clan forces around him, like a man clutching at torn fabric. He would spend another year conducting a last, futile campaign to reclaim power from the bush, bombarding towns along the Juba River with artillery, killing more of the people he claimed to lead, before finally slipping across the border into Kenya and eventually into exile in Nigeria, where he died in 1995. The manner of his leaving told you everything about what his rule had become. He had arrived in power in a tank of a different kind, the metaphorical tank of military authority, clean uniforms, revolutionary rhetoric, the promise of order after democratic chaos. He left in a literal one, fleeing through the rubble of a city his own forces had helped destroy, chased by the consequences of 21 years of decisions that had prioritised his own survival over the survival of the state he governed. Behind him, he left not a power vacuum but something worse, a power explosion. Every armed faction, every clan militia, every regional strongman who had been held in check by the gravitational force of the central government now flew outward in its own direction, filling the space where the state had been with the logic of the gun and the solidarity of the lineage group. Somalia had not merely lost a government, it had lost the idea of government, and rebuilding that idea would prove, over the following decades, to be one of the most intractable problems the modern world had encountered. Mogadishu, in 1991 and 1992, was something that most people, reading about it from the safety of distant countries, struggled to fully comprehend. The city of perhaps 1 million people, a real city, with universities and hospitals and hotels, and a functioning port, a city that had hosted the Organization of African Unity Summit just 17 years earlier, descended into a war of such comprehensive violence that it ceased to function as a city at all. It became a collection of clan-controlled neighborhoods, each defended by armed militias, separated by front lines that shifted block by block, week by week, in fighting that combined modern weaponry with ancient grievances in the most lethal possible combination. The proximate cause of Mogadishu's particular agony was a split within the Hawiye clan, which had formed the core of the Somali National Congress, the armed group that had driven Bare from power. General Mohammed Farah Aidid, commanding the Habar Gidir sub-clan faction of the Hawiye, and Ali Mahdi Mohammed, representing the Abgal sub-clan, had liberated Mogadishu together and then immediately fallen into conflict over who would control the capital. Ali Mahdi declared himself interim president. Aidid refused to recognize the claim. The city divided, north for Ali Mahdi, south for Aidid, and the artillery opened up. The civilian population of Mogadishu, who had survived Bare's increasingly erratic violence through the late 1980s and celebrated his departure as a liberation, now discovered that liberation without governance was simply a different kind of prison. The militias that controlled each neighborhood were not accountable to anyone. Looting was systematic, hospitals were stripped of equipment, factories of machinery, even the wiring was ripped from the walls of government buildings and sold for scrap. The port, the airport, the infrastructure of urban life, all of it became a resource to be extracted rather than maintained. Because no faction had sufficient control or sufficient time horizon to think about what the city might need to function next year. The agricultural zones of southern Somalia, the inter-riverine territory between the Shebel and Juba rivers, the most fertile land in the country, the zone that had fed the south for centuries, were turned into a killing ground as Aidid's forces and the remnants of Bare's army chased each other back and forth across the farmland. The farming communities, primarily the Rahanwain clans and the Somali Bantu communities, who had worked this land for generations, were caught between armed factions that stole their harvests, conscripted their young men, and killed anyone who resisted. The result was famine. Not a drought-induced famine of the kind that the region had suffered periodically throughout its history, but a man-made famine, a famine produced by the systematic destruction of food production and distribution systems by armed groups who were, in the most literal sense, eating the future to fuel the present. United Nations agencies estimated that somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000 Somalis died of starvation and related causes in 1991 and 1992. Roughly 1 million more fled the country as refugees, to Kenya, to Ethiopia, to Yemen, to Europe, to North America, to wherever they could reach. The images reached television screens around the world in mid-1992, and the reaction was the particular kind of horror that comes from seeing suffering so extreme that it overwhelms the normal mechanisms of emotional distance. Skeletal children, mothers holding infants too weak to cry, aid workers describing conditions that sounded like the 19th century or worse. In December 1992, the United States, in the last weeks of the George H.W. Bush administration, launched Operation Restore Hope, a military intervention designed to secure the distribution of humanitarian aid that armed factions were systematically stealing. The intervention was, initially, successful on its own terms. The presence of American and Allied forces opened corridors for aid delivery, reduced the most brazen looting of food shipments, and saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to starvation. But the mission crept. The incoming Clinton administration expanded the objectives from humanitarian protection to something more ambitious: the disarmament of the factions, the restoration of order, the beginning of a process that might lead to a functioning Somali government. This required confronting the faction leaders, particularly Aidid, who correctly understood that disarmament meant the end of his political relevance and responded by turning his militia against the international forces. On the 3rd of October, 1993, American Special Operations Forces launched a raid in South Mogadishu to capture senior aides of Aidid. What happened next became one of the most documented military disasters in recent American history: the Battle of Mogadishu, the Black Hawk Down incident, in which 2 American helicopters were shot down, 18 American soldiers were killed, and the bodies of some of them were dragged through the streets of the city in scenes broadcast around the world. The political impact in Washington was immediate and decisive. Within months, American forces had withdrawn from Somalia. The broader UN mission, UNOSOM II, staggered on for another year and a half before also withdrawing in early 1995. The international community, burned by the experience, drew a lesson that would shape its approach to African crises for the next decade. The costs of deep engagement were too high, the prospects for success too uncertain, and the political will to sustain an intervention through the inevitable setbacks was not available. Somalia was left to itself. The famine had been partially addressed. The political crisis that had produced the famine had not been touched. The armed factions remained armed. The clan militias remained organised. The international forces departed, and the fighting resumed. While southern Somalia was consuming itself in faction warfare, something remarkable was happening in the north. The former British Somaliland, the territory that had spent 30 years as an afterthought of the Somali Republic, that had suffered deliberate marginalisation under Bare, and then the systematic destruction of Hargeisa by government forces in the late 1980s, made a decision that was, in the context of everything happening around it, almost impossibly sane. In May 1991, the Somali National Movement and the clan communities of the north convened a series of traditional peace conferences, the Shir Bilid, or clan reconciliation gatherings, that drew on the oldest mechanisms of Somali conflict resolution. Elders, poets, religious leaders, and community representatives came together in tent cities and argued, in the way Somali communities had argued for centuries, until they reached agreements that all parties could live with. The process was slow, it was messy, there were setbacks. A brief civil war within the north itself in 1994, between subclans of the Azark, that threatened to replicate the southern catastrophe. But the northern communities pulled back from the brink, returned to the reconciliation process, and found their way through. In 1991, the north declared independence as Somaliland, restoring, roughly, the borders of the former British protectorate. No country in the world recognised this independence. The African Union, committed to the principle of inviolable colonial borders, refused. The United Nations, committed to the fiction of Somali state sovereignty, refused. Somaliland existed in a legal limbo, unrecognised, technically part of a Somali state that no longer functioned, but governing itself, building its own institutions, holding its own elections, maintaining its own currency and its own security forces. And it worked. Not perfectly. Somaliland has its own tensions, its own governance challenges, its own unresolved conflicts with the neighbouring Puntland region over contested territory. But compared to what was happening in the south, the contrast was so stark as to seem almost miraculous. A region that had been bombed to rubble rebuilt itself. A political system that drew on traditional clan mechanisms of consensus and reconciliation produced something that looked, increasingly, like genuine democratic governance. Elections were held and accepted. Power changed hands peacefully. The light stayed on. Somaliland became, for scholars of state building and conflict resolution, one of the most fascinating experiments in political reconstruction in the modern world, a case study in how communities can rebuild governance from the bottom up, using the social technologies they actually have, rather than the institutional templates imported from outside. The lesson that Somaliland offered, that the clan system, so often described as the primary obstacle to Somali political development, could also be the primary resource for political reconstruction when properly engaged, was one that the international community was slow to absorb because it complicated the clean narratives that outside actors preferred. In the South, the years between the American withdrawal in 1994 and the early 2000s were a period of grinding, fragmented, exhausting conflict that defied simple description. There was no government, there was no national army, there was no central bank, no functioning court system, no national police. There were faction leaders, clan militias, local strongmen, and the occasional warlord who controlled enough territory to extract resources from it. There were also, increasingly, businessmen, Somali entrepreneurs, who discovered that in the absence of a state, private enterprise could fill some of the gaps. Telecommunications companies established mobile phone networks that worked better than anything the state had managed. Money transfer businesses developed hawala systems that moved remittances from the Somali diaspora, hundreds of millions of dollars annually, into the country without a formal banking system to route them through. Somali resilience, in other words, was real. The same qualities that had allowed the Somali people to survive for millennia in a harsh and unpredictable environment, adaptability, resourcefulness, the ability to build functional social arrangements from the materials at hand were visible even in the wreckage of the state. Life went on. Markets functioned. Children went to school in buildings that the militias hadn't yet destroyed. But resilience is not the same as flourishing. The costs of statelessness were borne overwhelmingly by the most vulnerable. The farming communities of the south, who had no militia to protect them, the women who bore the specific violences of conflict, the children who grew up knowing nothing but the grammar of the gun, the ordinary people who wanted nothing more complicated than security and the ability to plan for next year. A series of reconciliation conferences, held outside Somalia, in Djibouti, in Kenya, in Ethiopia, attempted to construct a transitional government from the faction leaders and clan representatives. These efforts produced agreements that lasted months, sometimes weeks, before collapsing. The fundamental problem was structural. The agreements were made by armed faction leaders whose authority derived from their control of weapons and their clan constituencies, and who had rational incentives to avoid any settlement that would require them to surrender either. In the mid-2000s, something unexpected happened. The Islamic Courts Union, a network of Sharia courts that had been operating quietly in Mogadishu and surrounding areas, providing the only functional dispute resolution system available to ordinary people, suddenly expanded its military capabilities and swept the faction leaders out of Mogadishu. In June 2006, the Islamic Courts Union controlled the capital for the first time since 1991. The reaction of ordinary Mogadishu residents was, by multiple accounts, one of relief verging on euphoria. For the first time in 15 years, there was something resembling public order. The militias that had terrorized neighborhoods were gone. The checkpoints where faction fighters had extorted money from anyone trying to move through the city were dismantled. People went to the beach. Football was played in public. Women walked without the specific fear that had been a constant companion of urban life during the faction years. It lasted 6 months. Ethiopia, alarmed by the emergence of an Islamist administration on its border, deeply aware of the historical Somali-Ethiopian tensions, and supported by American intelligence and logistics, intervened militarily in December 2006. Ethiopian forces, combined with the soldiers of the transitional federal government that the international community had assembled in Kenya, swept the Islamic Courts Union from power in a matter of weeks. The Ethiopian intervention solved one problem and created several others. The Islamic Courts Union, driven from power but not destroyed, fragmented. Its most radical elements, particularly the faction that would become Al-Shabaab, concluded from the experience that moderate Islamism had failed, that only more extreme methods could succeed, and that the external powers who had intervened were legitimate targets. Al-Shabaab emerged as an insurgency, then as a significant territorial force, then as a regional threat that attracted international jihadist fighters and conducted attacks beyond Somalia's borders. The story was not over. It is not over now. Somalia has had governments since, transitional governments, federal governments, internationally recognized administrations headquartered in Mogadishu that have gradually, painfully, extended a degree of authority over parts of the country. Al-Shabaab has been pushed back from major cities, though it remains a lethal presence in rural areas and continues to conduct bombings in Mogadishu. Somaliland continues its unrecognized but functioning self-governance in the north. The federal government in Mogadishu continues its contested, incomplete, internationally supported effort to rebuild something that functions like a state. The process is real, the progress is real, and the distance yet to travel is also real. Step back from the specific details, the clan names, the faction leaders, the intervention forces, the dates and battles, and ask the larger question that this entire history has been building toward. How does this happen? How does a people with a rich civilization, a sophisticated oral tradition, a genius for adaptation, a genuine democratic impulse encoded in their customary law, how do they end up here? How does a country that celebrated independence with dancing in the streets end up as the global dictionary definition of state failure? The answer is not a single cause. It never is. But the threads are visible, running through every chapter of this story. Colonial partition created a political problem with no solution inside the available political framework. The 5-pointed star on the Somali flag was not just a symbol, it was a structural contradiction. A nation defined by its aspiration to unity could not be stable while the territories that defined that unity remained under foreign sovereignty. Every Somali government was trapped between the domestic imperative to pursue unification and the international imperative to accept the borders the colonial powers had drawn. The clan system, misunderstood by outsiders as simply a source of division, was actually a double-edged instrument. In the absence of state institutions strong enough to provide security and justice, the clan provided both. But it did so at the cost of limiting political action to the scale of the lineage group, making large-scale collective action for national purposes structurally difficult, and creating incentive structures that consistently rewarded clan loyalty over national loyalty. The Cold War treated Somalia as a resource to be exploited rather than a society to be supported. The weapons that the superpowers poured into the Horn of Africa during the 1970s and 1980s to arm Somalia against Ethiopia, then Ethiopia against Somalia, then various factions within Somalia itself, remained in the country long after the Cold War ended, cheap and abundant, available to anyone with the will to use them. The militarization of Somali politics was not an indigenous product. It was, in very significant part, an import. And Siad Barre, the man who promised to cut through the clan system and build a genuinely national state, ultimately made everything worse. He began with genuine vision and real achievements. He ended by weaponizing the clan system more thoroughly than any of his predecessors, turning it from a cultural identity into a tool of political violence, systematically building the very dynamic that his revolution had promised to destroy. But this story cannot end, and should not end, in pure darkness, because there is another Somalia, the Somalia that exists alongside the failed state, that has existed through all of it, that will exist after the current crisis resolves into whatever comes next. It is the Somalia of the diaspora, the millions of Somalis who fled the violence and built lives, in Nairobi, in Minneapolis, in Oslo, in Dubai, in Toronto, sending money home, maintaining connections, carrying the culture across oceans and raising children who are both Somali and something else, who move between worlds in ways their grandparents could not have imagined. It is the Somalia of Somaliland, that quietly extraordinary experiment in self-governance, building democratic institutions from clan reconciliation processes, holding elections that actually mean something, demonstrating that the Somali people's political incapacity is not inherent or inevitable, but was produced by specific historical forces that specific political choices can undo. It is the Somalia of the poets, still writing, still performing, still using the oldest technology of Somali civilization to make sense of what has happened and to imagine what might come next. The tradition that encoded resistance to colonialism in the compositions of Muhammad Abdullah Hassan, that shaped public opinion through the parliamentary era, that served as propaganda and as consolation through the faction years, that tradition is alive. And it is the Somalia of the ordinary people who never stopped trying to live decent lives in impossible circumstances, the market traders and the teachers and the nurses and the farmers and the fishermen who kept doing what they could in whatever space the violence left them, because that is what people do. The horn that was ancient before the world knew its name has survived conquest, partition, Cold War, and Civil War. It has been called the Fragrant Cape, the Land of Punt, the Cinderella of Empire, the world's most failed state. None of those labels is wrong. None of them is complete. What it is, finally and most essentially, is a place where a people have been living, adapting, creating, and enduring for longer than most of the world's current political arrangements have existed. Whatever comes next in Somalia will be built by those people, from the materials they have in the only homeland they have ever had. The story is not over. It never was.